I think I can start and others can join us. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the very first research conversation of spring 2025. I want to use this opportunity to first thank A.G. Rod for his many years of service working with the ADR office on research conversations. Thank you so very much, AG, and we wish you the very best in your retirement. AG might not be here today, but please let him know we acknowledge his many years of contributions to the development of our research conversations. I also want to use this opportunity to welcome Kira Carbono, who will be our faculty rep on planning research conversations. Welcome, Kira, and thanks to Laura Girardeau for all the help that you have rendered over these many years as well. Today, I have such a great pleasure of introducing our research conversation speaker, Dr. Josh Taylor. Josh will speak on improving post-school outcomes for youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities through strategic team-based lines of research. Josh Taylor is an assistant professor of special education in the Department of Teaching and Learning here at Washington State University. Dr. Taylor draws from his background as a K-12 special educator to inform his research and teaching with a focus and passion around promoting positive outcomes for students with autism and other intellectual and developmental disabilities. He earned his PhD in special education from Virginia Commonwealth University with a focus on research to policy implementation and a master's in education from the University of Virginia. Although Dr. Taylor's background is in K-12 settings, much of his research is focused on employment interventions and outcomes, particularly for transition age youths. If you have not been privileged to meet or have discussion with Dr. Josh Taylor, that's a hole that we have to address today. So thank you for being here. Josh is such a pleasant colleague, such a great scholar. We are happy to have you here today, Josh. And over to you.
Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction, Shola, and really appreciate the opportunity to get to see you all and share a little bit of I think what's kind of worked. I'll share my screen and first off, apologize for the long title there. You know, the first part of that really just I think refers to the kind of field and the area that I focus my research in. The second part of that team-based lines of research I think is really what I'm hoping to share today. And for me, really comes out of, going back to, for those of you who don't know, Holly and I both did our doc work at Virginia Commonwealth University, and sort of had some unique experience. Both of us worked for a grant-funded center, and then also, had mentors and professors on the academic side. And, the course that we took, particularly we had a great professor for grant writing and who was, immensely productive and brought in millions of dollars of funding to VCU, but presented this sort of idea of the kind of academic career as this, hey, you find this sort of your niche, the brick that you're going to sort of put into that hole in the wall in terms of contributing to what's happening already in the field. And, you stay narrow and focused, and, you build up to that big IES or NSF or NIH, or whatever the major funding for you is. And that's, you don't get it, you reapply next year, and you keep going for that one sort of like narrow topic. And for me, that was never really the way. And fortunately, I've kind of found, I think, a different way to kind of be a little bit broader but use teams and find others that are sort of engaged in that work to hopefully have a broader impact. So I want to share a little bit about sort of the broad context for those of you that aren't in special ed, and kind of just to kind of frame some of the problems that we're facing as a field, and just sort of the kind of what we call wicked problems, or the kind of thorny kind of, kind of intermesh overlapping problems that really require us to take kind of novel approaches to how we do research to try to solve it. So I'll give a brief background, talk about some of the main problems and potential solutions, and then the most of it's really going to be just sharing sort of some of the research teams that I have the privilege of kind of working with, talking about how we formed. I've had the opportunity to kind of get to connect with some of these teams in different ways, through kind of networking through conferences, through knowing colleagues, through friends of friends, through mentors and more senior folks in the field. So just sharing a little bit about sort of how I've had the privilege to come into kind of working with some great folks, and some of the work that we're doing that contributes some of these different pieces that forms kind of a broader research agenda, but has these specific lines that are more strategic. So to give a little bit of background, so as Shola mentioned, kind of the work that Holly, Marcus, and I do really focuses on those outcomes of, like, what happens to students with disabilities after they leave that K-12 system, and what are those outcomes as far as their, the career opportunities they have, their engagement in employment, their access to higher education, those things that happen after school, right? And so this is the kind of doom and gloom chart that we refer to a lot of just showing kind of the progress, or more accurately, the lack thereof, with that bottom part, that competitive integrated employment. So that's sort of the gold standard of what we as a field are aiming for the folks that we work with, as far as we really want folks to have real jobs or real pay within the community, contributing to their communities, contributing to employers and businesses, and being able to kind of fulfill their potential to kind of find jobs that match their strengths, match their career interests. And so you can see, we've largely kind of not made progress. We have, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that my colleagues and I are doing around ending subminimum wage practices. For those of you that don't know, folks with disabilities are the only group in the United States that are allowed to be paid less than minimum wage. Employers or institutions have to apply to the Department of Labor for a specific waiver to provide those. So you can see we're starting to kind of close the gap in those. About 8 states so far have ended or in the process of phasing out the subminimum wage waivers. But as you can see, we've got this huge kind of expansion of folks that are just totally disengaged from work altogether. So some kind of serious problems that have a few different roots. So kind of as a field, again, big summary of the field, kind of what we know across the board. A lot of what we know about what works for folks with disabilities in terms of this transition to adulthood and employment comes from secondary data analysis of a data set called National Longitudinal Transition Study, and some other data sources out there that have kind of given us a body of research to describe what we call predictors of post-school success. And Marcus here is on a couple seminal papers led by Val Mazzotti now at the University of Kansas that really describe these predictors of post-school success. And so a few of those, just to highlight, there's about 20 altogether. And these are different than evidence-based practices, because they're really talking about what are the things that we want to kind of put in place for students, those experiences, those opportunities that we know that if folks have access to inclusive education, if we know that they have opportunities to practice and exert self-determination, if they have work experience for pay before they graduate from high school, if they're engaging in career and technical education, we know they're going to have better trajectories and outcomes as far as career success, being independent and engaged in their communities, accessing higher education. But we've got some things that are, we know that we have those poor outcomes we saw on the graph before. One of the problems is we've got limited access to inclusive education. We've got a lot of folks that are still segregated and restricted from getting that really robust academic instruction from general education teachers, right? And those outcomes are even worse when we look at, folks from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. We do a really kind of poor job of looking at that intersectional, those intersectional needs of folks that are kind of coming at this from different ways. And we also have limitations for folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so when we talk about that, we're talking about autistic students with intellectual disability, things like that. So, we know kind of what works, but we still got this kind of practice gap of the things aren't happening that we need for folks to get on those better outcomes. And so when we kind of look across the board, part of it is we've got this sort of these kind of two kind of camps within special education, kind of pulling between the folks that are really saying, hey, the answer is really we need to really make sure that our students are included in academic coursework, and that inclusive education piece is really what's going to lead the day. Another group that says, we also know that folks need vocational programming, we need work experiences. And so, both groups, I think, and as a field, we know that students we need both of those, right? We need to be kind of engaged and have high expectations about that academic instruction and accommodations and supports in place to make sure students are successful and are accessing kind of universal design for learning, multi-tiered systems of success, as a lot of Michael's work is engaged in. But how do we prioritize these, right? And then we also know that there's this research to practice gap, not unique to special education. Certainly, even fields outside of education struggle with this. We know what happens with research. Some of that filters down to policy, and even less than that gets down to the services that students are receiving. And then even within that, we've got issues of equity within, the groups that are able to kind of access that high quality, rigorous instruction. And so, there's also a need to kind of engage directly with these sort of service apparatuses and systems that are delivering those services to make sure we have coordinated service delivery that's putting those best practices in place. So long story short, we've got this kind of big, kind of immense system that we kind of have some information about what works, and we've got a lot more sort of background in terms of what we need to do than we did 2 decades ago. But there's this problem of how do we get coordinated service delivery in place? How do we inform policy and interpret policy both at the national level in terms of legislation that comes out, but also at the state level and supporting our state education agencies, our vocational rehabilitation agencies, implement this and figure out how to do this work together, right? And then how does that mean for teacher education and how we're preparing special education teachers to be able to kind of do and do this work directly and collaborate with other people? So, we've got these big kind of immense problems that require us to be able to kind of bring together different lenses and different ways of looking at the problems facing folks with disabilities. And so for me, the answer of, how do we do this kind of big, broad, immense work for me is not, find this little niche and kind of stay there for a career and, keep trying for the same couple grants over and over. But the answer for me has been teaming up, finding other folks that are engaged and wanting to make an impact on this work and finding those ways to sort of bring together those specific lines that get at policy implementation, research to practice gaps, thinking about, balancing, the services that students get. So a lot of what I'll talk about today, and hopefully I won't run over too much, is just talking about some of those teams that we've been able to form over the years and sort of some of the work that we're doing. And I'm going to ask that Holly and Marcus and Di jump in with, because you'll see your pictures on some of these slides to help me talk about some of this work together. So the first is one of my favorite groups. This is what we call the WIOA. The WIOA is the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. And that's sort of the big legislation that came out about 10 years ago that really changed services, reauthorized the Rehabilitation Act, and stipulated that vocational rehabilitation had to start providing services to transition age youth. And so back when Holly and I were doc students, like we call it, or I call it our Goonies project, because we decided we weren't going to wait for sort of like, a senior, faculty member advisor to sort of bring us on a project. We wanted to kind of go do the work, right? And so we brought an initial team together of Megan Rooney Crone, who's now at University of Missouri St. Louis. She was a doc student at Illinois at the time. And we kind of put a team together to start looking at these kind of state plans, these plans that states would submit to the federal government. And we devised a coding procedure and looked at, we used a cluster analysis to come up with a sample. Really had this kind of interesting paper where we looked at, how are states, kind of interpreting and trying to go about this work to do this really fundamental change in the way that feds have said they have to do business. And what we found was that, states have interpreted that in lots of different ways. And since then, we've had 3 follow-up papers. The 4th one's coming out soon. And so the little icons there are showing papers that each of us led. So you can see Holly's led 2. I've led the first one. And then our colleague, Sarah Carlson at the University of New Mexico is leading this newest one. And so Holly's looked at, we did a regression analysis and an analysis of like how much did states look at, incorporating those predictors of post-school success, those things that we know students need to have, how much were those really reflected in those plans that shifted over those policies? Holly, anything else you want to say about the state plan team?
Oh, I was about to type in the chat, just that the plans were free and publicly available, which was a huge win for us as grad students. So, yeah.
Have to submit any authorization to IES for access to a data set. They were right there. We downloaded them. And so this was a nice way to kind of get started and kind of figure out start to finish how to run a project. But that's been a fun team that's still going strong. I don't know how many presentations we've done, and they're now close friends and things like that. All right. Next one is kind of more recent. So this is our career tech ed experiences and outcomes team. And so this is working with Di and Holly and Owner and Anya. And so this, Holly and I had some interest well, first started with, even before I got to Pullman, I had talked with Shola about an interest in kind of continuing to work off a secondary data set called the High School Longitudinal Study. And Shola was really supportive in connecting me with Di even before I got out here. And Di had worked with some other IES data sets and was just super helpful and said, hey, yeah, I'd be happy to help you kind of get started and get access to that. And so even before I got out to Pullman, Di was helping get access and we were emailing back and forth. And so when I arrived, we kind of just started, hey, let's look at some projects we can work on together using this data set and looking at it. And Holly and I had some interest in career and technical education, and Diane had some interest in looking at the experiences of multilingual learners. And so we said, hey, let's put together a faculty funding award proposal. And we were fortunate enough to get the award. And so we were kind of getting started and writing up. We've got a first draft of the initial descriptive paper and planning a regression analysis, looking at those experiences of how do folks with disabilities engage within career and technical education? The policy that kind of drives that, the Perkins Act, has said for years and years that students with disabilities are a priority group, but they continue to be a priority group and are not getting access, not included. What we're finding so far is really interesting. This, especially in Washington, this is really a priority. The helping career and beyond plan, the high school and beyond plan really is the idea is that career and tech ed kind of sets in motion this career pathways. But we found from the data so far, at least with this HSLS sample, is that folks who took CTE, most of them are working in something unrelated to that, 5-10 years out of that, right? And so that pathway is not happening so far. And so we're really curious what we're going to find. We're working with a journal that's doing kind of an open science framework. And so we're going to submit a registered report for that and go through that process for the second manuscript. But really interested to see kind of what we find about like why that pathway is breaking down for students. So some interesting findings there. Okay, so next one is really kind of focused on sort of that issue of equity. So what we know is we shared earlier. So, we've got, all these kind of, issues with kind of folks with disabilities and folks with IDD and general stuff. But we know that those outcomes are even worse for Black students, for Latino students, for language learners, because this kind of like breakdown between, the systems that are in place and sort of meeting the needs of culturally and linguistically diverse students. So this really formed, out of LaRon Scott, who's now at the University of Virginia, was one of my advisors at VCU. And so this was a traditional kind of like senior advisor lab model. And a lot of what I learned about sort of setting up a research pipeline and how to run a lab was due to LaRon. So a lot of credit to him about, he really had some nice structures in place and really facilitated kind of bringing on graduate and doctoral students to be able to be engaged and have opportunities to not only be part of research, but to kind of lead studies after a couple times and kind of getting the hang of it. So focused on this, we were able to publish two articles and a textbook chapter related to these issues of specifically the experiences of Black youth with intellectual disability and their self-determination in the transition process, and really kind of found some really interesting things about not only how the transition process itself introduced some barriers related to to their racial identity, but also those broader contextual factors of their school experiences and their community experiences, how the physical layout and racial segregation within these communities actually impacted, their self-determination within transition and how that advocacy had to kind of take place. So some really interesting things that we're still in the process of looking for funding to kind of continue following up on that and looking at, what can we do in teacher education to kind of better prepare students to combat some of these factors. Next, we've got Holly and Marcus on this one. So this is a really fun team that started out from kind of a previous grant back when I was working for the Center at VCU, the grant called the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on the Employment of Individuals with IDD. And so that Lauren Avalone here, I don't know if you can see my cursor here at the bottom, was the principal investigator of one of 5 research studies on that. And essentially, we had kind of gotten through, a series of systematic reviews that I'll share in a little bit. And we had promised the funder that we would do the systematic review on policy. And we were kind of stumped about like, hey, how do we do this? Or we promised this, but we didn't think through this. How do we do a review of policy? And as we shared earlier, Holly and I had done some work looking at these state plans. We were kind of a couple manuscripts in, and we talked to Lauren about like, hey, it'd be really cool to kind of look at some data from folks that are doing this work, and there's this administrative data set out there. And so the 3 of us were able to get in contact with Tim Tanzi at University of Wisconsin, who had access to the data, and he was able to provide it and kind of walk us through that. And so we were able to kind of start analyzing and kind of figuring out, hey, we know from these plans, this is what states said they're going to do, these state agencies, but what are they actually doing on the other end? And through that, Tim brought on 2 of his doc students who were at the University of Washington, Yasmin Castrita Rios and Sarah Park, who's now, Yasmin's at Michigan State now, and has just got a job at UNT, so she's moving over there in the fall. And we brought on Marcus. First manuscript, we had these really interesting findings, and we're like, man, we could really use some help interpreting these. Who do we know that really is just a guru of understanding VR systems and WIOA and the intent of this. And so Marcus was jumped on that first one and really gave us some great insight and been part of the team ever since. But that's been a really productive team, and we're I think on our 5th paper now, looking at additional funding for how we can continue doing this work. And Sarah's shifted over into looking at what this data shares with us about those minimum wage practices in particular. This next team is kind of an interesting one. So this was started recently. We were starting on our first paper, Holly and I, with Ann Rue and Jessica Rast at Drexel University. And this one started out kind of a pen pal situation, if I'm honest. So back when Holly and I were doc students and did that first sort of Goonies paper, as I called it, Ann Rue, who's a really well-established researcher in autism. She does kind of public health and epidemiology research. Reached out and was, she was one of a couple people that had worked with these state plans before, and just said, "Hey, read your paper. It was great." And at that time, as a doc student, I was like, "Oh my goodness, somebody I know read my paper. This is and said nice things about it. This is wonderful." And so Ann and I kind of kept up over the years, and then they had a paper that they were, really trying to think about how to interpret those findings, and so they reached out, and so we've been working with that similar data set on autism specific stuff. So just kind of an interesting one of, I like to kind of highlight it because it kind of came out in a different way than we normally think about. But just having those conversations and talking to people in the field sometimes, can lead to opportunities. And we're really excited about the first couple papers with them. We have some really interesting perspectives that I don't think we would have come to before, not, just working with special ed folks and rehab counseling folks. And Hall, I'm going to ask you to share a little bit about rural community rehab providers. We just met about this, and so this started as a sub-award. So Tim Tanzi, who we shared with before at University of Wisconsin, and then our former boss and mentor, Paul Wayman at VCU, had some additional funding through the Rehabilitation Services Administration with the Department of Ed, and we're looking for some small-scale demonstration projects. And Holly and I kind of pitched them on an idea that we had run into before of, these rural parts of Washington State, and certainly where I was in Maine before, had this real problem with the kind of service delivery gap, and that providers just weren't there weren't enough providers in some of these rural communities, and those that were, weren't getting access really into getting out to folks and providing that opportunity and choice to really engage in kind of employment within those communities. And so we kind of pitched this idea of like, how can we use technology to facilitate some of this? How, anything you want to share specifically about rural CRP? Or do you want me to kind of go over the basics of it?
Go for it. I would also say we just accidentally left Marcus and Anya off of, or you left Marcus
Sorry.
and Anya are also involved in this. They're coming on board with program or some evaluation data.
Sorry about that, Marcus. Yeah, excited for that. And so we'll be working with two these organizations called community rehabilitation providers. Some of you may be familiar with Boost here in Pullman. We're working with them. And then one out of Spokane called Artisans. And we've had just great success so far. They've been, I think folks are a little apprehensive. We're going to do what? And that sounds, we're excited. We struggle with this rural service delivery, but they've really just kind of been fantastic to work with. And Don's had some great ideas and strategies using AI, using robotics, using telehealth strategies that are. And what we found so far is that folks are those job coaches that work for these two community rehab providers have traveled less and gotten more services in place. So exactly what we want to see. So we're in the process of conducting some research, some single case studies, and some practitioner papers on this, and just kind of scaling this up and looking for some funding to kind of build on this, to kind of look at how we can expand it out to more providers. And so the next one kind of goes back a little bit in time for me, going back to my time at the University of Maine, that kind of builds some of the foundation for the work that Holly and Don and Angel and Marcus, Danya, and I are doing, related to kind of working with community rehab providers in rural communities. And that was a state grant out of the Department of Health and Human Services. And I think this one's an interesting one because it kind of highlights state contract work and some of the background that I had in sort of grant-based centers, as far as, I think we think in as academic faculty about, what are research grants that we can do to kind of pursue research, but sometimes these training and service grants can really kind of help not only build partnerships with state partners, but also kind of build the foundation for really interesting research. And so this really started from some service work that I had done in the state that kind of looked at some kind of broad kind of implementation of policy initiatives statewide. And I developed some good relationships with the Health and Human Services director. And so they kind of reached out and said, hey, we've got this big training and technical assistance grant. Would you like to kind of do some of the work we've been talking about for a while? I said, yeah, absolutely. Like, I don't know that I have the infrastructure to be able to do the scale of this. But I reached out to what's called a UCED, a University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. So these are funded most states across the country at different universities. Ours, unfortunately, in Washington is at UW, but our friends over at University of Idaho have the Idaho UCED, the CCI, no, CCIDS is Maine. Help me out. I can't remember. University of Idaho has the UCED here, over here. So we reached out to the UCED at the University of Maine with Alan Cobo-Lewis and Janet May, and they said, yeah, we'd love to do this, but even we don't have the capacity to do the scale of this. We actually reached out to another UCED, a larger one at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, the Institute for Community Inclusion, and pulled in another colleague that was in the University of Maine system, is now at Cornell. And as a group, kind of like, you looked at like, how can we sort of meet these state needs to provide services to schools and educators, but also to those community rehab providers to get those best practices, to get that kind of research validated interventions in place. And so that was really helpful for me to kind of work directly, and kind of led to some of the work that we've done since then as related to kind of rural CRP development. So next one kind of goes back to, some of our RTC, VCU teams. And so this comes from So as I touched on before, some of the work we did before was this previous grant cycle of this Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on the employment of individuals with IDD. That came up again, and VCU won that main award again for another 5 years. And so we were able to get written in as a sub-award of a sub-award to be a site of a scale-up of a project called the Tech Prep Program that had been previously piloted in Chicago public schools, led by our now familiar friend Tim Tansey at University of Wisconsin, Madison. And so, Paul Wayman of VCU will be the kind of lead on that. And then we'll be working with the University of Wisconsin to be a Washington site and work with Spokane Public Schools and Cheney, did I say it right? Cheney Public Schools to implement really kind of a tech career mentorship program. There's a soft skills training component modeled after a DOL training called Skills That Pay the Bills, which is a little cheesy, but it is what it is. And then kind of a mentorship program that has an internship piece where we'll actually be working with employers, tech employers in the Spokane area to actually place students in there. So we're really excited about that. That'll be a kind of 5-year project that we'll be kind of scaling up and working with another site in Southeast Virginia near where Holly's from. So I'm excited about that one. Holly, anything else you want to share about that one? Nope. Okay. And then, that kind of builds off going back to, again, my time at VCU, the previous cycle with the RTC and IDD, and the work that we did with that. So again, this was the kind of sort of main core of that work that we did and started with the analysis of pre-ETS services and pre-employment transition services through that rehabilitation services administrative data set that Holly and Marcus and I are working on now. The main part of it was really kind of synthesizing sort of what we know from the research. And so again, Lauren Avalone here was the principal investigator of a research study. Overall there were 6 total studies, and I kind of co-PI'd with her. And our kind of task was, and how do we pull together what we know about what promotes employment of folks with IDD? And so initially, as it was written into the grant, it was supposed to be just one systematic review. Hey, just write a paper, summarize everything, 35 pages, what do we know? And what we soon realized was that one sort of, kind of paper framing the kind of pathway to employment wasn't going to cut it. And so we actually decided to kind of chop it up into, I think, 10, 12 papers that looked at different pathways, looking at higher employment, inclusion in higher employment or in higher education and how that led to employment, looking at internships, looking at comparing segregated and integrated employment settings, looking at the benefits of competitive integrated employment on the health and well-being of folks with disabilities. So each of these kind of different perspectives, and so we're able to kind of distribute sort of leadership of those to kind of be quite productive over that 5-year period and get a lot of papers out. So you can see the kind of icons of different folks that led different papers related to different services, different interventions, different outcomes, and we're really able to kind of get quite a bit out there into the field. Mostly systematic reviews with a few Delphi studies mixed in. And then kind of most recently, Howie and I are starting some work with some other folks at VCU on another grant related to supporting employment through higher education. And so for this one, we'll be working with primarily colleges, community colleges. It could be disability services disability services offices. It could be inclusive post-secondary education folks, and really just focus on providing training, technical assistance, and coaching related to how they can promote employment for the folks they're working with within the context of higher education. So again, just different ways to kind of get at providing these pathways to employment. And then the last one I want to share is sort of a little bit of a different group. And so this kind of goes back to Roger Adachi at George Washington University. And I started working back when I was a special education teacher in DC. I did, again, some service work and volunteer with the Smithsonian Institute on some of their accessibility programs. And Roger and I got to be, friends and colleagues. And so I've been working with Roger since then on sort of, accessibility, and had previously worked on PCORI grants out of the NIH, looking more specifically at community engagement. But then recently, the Rehabilitation Services Administration had an opportunity to do some Disability Innovation Fund, which really tried to promote sort of model demonstration projects. And the Kennedy Center, Performing Arts Center out of DC, had a program looking at some internship models and apprenticeship for artists with disabilities. And so through those connections, was kind of brought on to be kind of the voc rehab person on that team and help with the evaluation. And that's really focused on, helping specifically artists with disabilities and those working in creative careers to kind of to get supports and pathways. And it's been really interesting so far, even in initial conversations on that project, to just see the cultural differences, I think, between the way that artists and folks in creative careers kind of make money and engage in gig work, and these sort of like service systems which are set up to think about successful outcomes in very different ways. So that's been an interesting team to work with so far. So that is all of my teams, but I just wanted to share kind of the breadth and diversity of those, because for me, it's been like, that's what's helped me to be kind of productive, this far in my career. But also I think demonstrates that like, they haven't all come about in the same way. It's been a mix of both, like, really relying on mentorship from senior folks, engaging with other kind of earlier career folks in the field, networking and maintaining those contacts. And so, things that I've kind of gleaned from this, as far as, and I rely on these teams really to be able to kind of have this kind of research productivity and pipeline, is first just finding the right people. And I think about that as like, who's interested in doing the same work, or as far as like the similar problems, want to do it on the similar time frame. And so folks that I tend to want to work pretty fast and want to get papers out. And so, I don't work well with folks that want to do papers over a 3-year period, right? And so similar time frame, looking at similar method and having similar quality. So wouldn't you find those folks like, trying out the fit, looking for ways that, those teams that you work well with, hey, what's the next thing we're going to do? How can we look for funding to continue this work together? What's the next paper? Hey, do you want to lead something? And finding opportunities to both lead and also to share that leadership within teams. And I think once you say, that's why I wanted to share the kind of publication icon, not to, brag about how much we put out there, but just to share, like, a lot of what's been really successful with these teams is kind of that. Not that it has to be just a strict rotation all the time, but hey, even though we started this team, doesn't mean we have to lead all the papers. Like, have opportunities. Hey, you want to do that? Go for it. I'll write a couple sections for you. Let's do this together. You take the lead for a little bit, and that just keeps us all fresh and keeps us productive. And the fourth one is I learned from Laurent of just like priming that pipeline, and that's that idea of like kind of. And Laurent had a great visual for kind of mapping out. I probably should have included, of just thinking about like, what are were projects that you're in conceptual phase for, in design and data collection and data analysis and writing and revision and submission, and you've got out, and really trying to have papers in all those phases and research studies in all those phases to just keep that pipeline moving, right? And so that you're writing on something, you're analyzing on something, you've got something in each of those phases, just really kind of keeps that productivity going. I like the idea of laying breadcrumbs for the next thing. So I love writing discussion sections of papers, and I always like to, hey, like I found some answers, and I probably found more questions about this study. Like, what are the things I want to put out there to kind of follow up with next time around, and kind of putting it out there? Because honestly, there's more questions and problems within our field, and there's time to do them. So I don't fuss too much about it. If somebody else wants to take it and do the work before I get around to it, then so be it. But I like the idea of laying breadcrumbs. And then the last part is just like, every team and project doesn't need to do all the things, right? And so some of the teams that we shared, like, we've got funding and grant funding for through subawards, and there may be more service oriented, and other teams are more, we publish a lot, we haven't gotten funding for it, right? And we're just kind of working on that in the time that we have allotted to us as individuals, and that's okay, right? And I think the eventual goal for most of these teams is to be able to get larger funding, to scale up, to be able to do bigger and better. But it doesn't have to be, each of those teams doesn't have to do all the things all the time. Oop. And then kind of initial steps that worked for me, just talking to people, as I shared with the Drexel team, just like emailing folks and say, hey, I read your paper. That was an awesome paper. I love the beautiful discussion section. You really kind of nailed it with talking about X, Y, and Z, right? Those things really matter. And we love when we get them and just sharing them with other folks makes their day and really just helps to kind of like have that conversation that we need to have more often. For me, getting involved with associations, I'm on the board of the Division for Career Development and Transition, and a lot of those contacts that folks have worked with come through that. That's really helpful. And then through that, to get to know the other up and comers, like who are those folks that are at similar places? Like, not all the work we do can be with like the giants of the field that are already established and doing things. Who are the folks that are still figuring it out and hustling and trying to answer similar questions, right? So that's been really helpful to find other folks that like, hey, like I have similar goals, similar ambition. Let's get together and support each other and help with that. Um, Building relationships with state agencies and partners, and I'll give a shout out to Marcus here is just a fantastic person to talk to about that, and has just done some amazing work here in Washington State developing those partnerships. But that's really critical, and finding ways to sort of braid funding together to be able to do some work that promotes a research, but also does service to folks in the state. And then related to that connecting service with research, is that sometimes that funding, even though it's service oriented, and hey, we really want that research funding, I think can lead to, building a foundation to where we can actually, go for some of those bigger research grants that are really going to help us kind of move the field forward. For me, mentorship has been key. As much mentorship as I can get from more senior experienced folks to kind of guide the work that I do, but, both kind of directly, but also just, trying to figure out these pieces in terms of how to make an impact. And then the last one is just kind of the hustle one, right? Just making the most of every opportunity. And so when we get opportunities to produce, just over delivering what we promise on, whether it's, grant products or, quality of paper or the number of papers that we put out, or just kind of making sure that we take care of folks that provide opportunities to fund our work is really can't be overstated. So that's all I've got. Sorry if I ran a little over, but wanted to kind of open it up to ask, like, whether any of these stories and any of these models and teams that I've shared kind of resonate with you all, if how you collaborate in your work, what models you use, and whether you've had teams that have worked well, and honestly, I couldn't figure out a way to share the things that didn't work. So I kind of omitted those as well. But certainly there's teams and there's folks that you just don't work with too. So they didn't make a cut of this presentation, but I'd be lying if I said that they weren't out there too. So I want to kind of turn it over. Like, what are teams that you found or that you're looking for or that have worked for you? And I'll take this opportunity to mute myself and be quiet for a second.
Well, thank you, Josh, for that great presentation. Kudos to you and all the work that you're doing. I can see that it's making an impact, not just by the little icons, but by the amount of work and slides that you were able to talk on. It's really impacting the community in which you serve. So I appreciate you for that work that you're doing. And to think about your question of what didn't work well, I was actually going to flip that back to you. One of your first bullets is, like, find people who are similar in the hustle, right? Similar in the quality. How do you know, or, you've been in conversation, maybe starting a new collaboration. What's a signal to you that, oh, this may not be the similarity that I'm looking for? Do you have any words of advice for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of know when you know it. I mean, not to skirt on the answer or the question rather, but I think it can be within, those frustrations that pop up of like, hey, we're kind of stuck, we're not moving anywhere, or like, oh my goodness, this person is trying to schedule like a twice a week meeting and I just don't have the bandwidth right now. I need to let it go. Or like, why is this person talking about like Marxist hegemonic like data analysis? Like that is not the coding structure that we had planned for this. So you know, I think you kind of know when you know of like that pacing, but also the like, whoa, that's a different sort of like lens that I was hoping to provide with that. And sometimes those are conversations that you have, and I mean, goodness, I mean, some of the folks whose photos pop up on that regularly, we've certainly had to have conversations and like coming together on various disagreements. But then there's also a point where it's just like, hey, maybe it's time to kind of work on some other teams. And I think that's the benefit of having lots of different teams that you're part of, is that like it's not all about this one sort of lab team that you're doing all the things with all the time, right? And that you can kind of more organically kind of let go of some projects, or just give a little bit extra slack and kind of come back to it maybe later if you want to jump back into things.
No, that's good advice. Just kind of, almost like trust your gut, right? Of how you're working with those individuals. And for those grad students on the presentation, realizing that you can't have all your eggs in one basket, right? And I really like that idea of having that pipeline. So it'd be good. Any suggestions on, you work on a lot of teams, modes of communication? Do you work differently with each one? Do you have a common theme? How does that look?
Yeah, I would say it differs from team to team. I mean, I think the basics, recurring meetings, and having both like structure, but also, I mean, I think what's unique to all the team, or what's consistent with all the teams, is that like I like all the people that I work with. And so especially like it's certainly a different dynamic with more senior folks, but I would say of like what I would consider like my peers, or our peers, I think we're all friends or friendly, like have a personal relationship as well as a professional one. And so like meetings are warm, like, and we talk,
Right.
spend the first 5-10 minutes catching up and like, hey, how was your birthday? Did you do anything fun? Like, is your mom doing all right? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so that dynamic is helpful, just to sort of have those connections. And then, I mean, the Drexel folks, we haven't even met physically yet, right? Holly and I. And so it's all been by email. So it just depends, right? Those
Yeah.
dynamics, and you got to kind of feel out those dynamics and figure out what works. But some amount of having shared documents. I won't say my opinion of OneDrive on the record. I feel I prefer Google Drive for most non-WSU specific teams, but having some kind of folder set up where we got some structure and some organization, where we kind of like, because one of the things with working with like 10 plus teams is like,
Yeah.
it helps to have like a dashboard, I call, of like my board here of like, what are the things that I longer term need to sort of keep my eye on. So when I'm out of the loop for a month, I can be like, okay, what were we doing? What were the research questions? Where we were at with that? What are the notes from the last meeting? Just kind of refresh my memory, because I would lose it otherwise.
Yeah.
But some of the mix of sort of those organic like relationships, just relationships with folks, and then also just some organizational structure to kind of keep us, to where it's not just all good vibes.
Yeah. No, I really like that idea of a dashboard of like for each project, right? Being it's something like a static document you can come back to.
Yeah. Yeah.
It looks like we have just 2 minutes left. I want to make sure there's anyone else who has any questions.
I'll share real quick before I step off. Just Josh, it's been really fun, and I've learned a lot from sort of that, being a part of the teams that you're on. And then it was helpful for me and fun to see kind of the breadth of those, and knowing that I'm a part of a couple of those, but seeing sort of that broader context, it really does help me think more about even my own pipeline and sort of the ways to kind of build some of those projects. And I think that the idea of that distributed leadership thing, I think, is something that you model really well. And Holly, I think you're a part of that too, where really it's that team approach. And maybe you don't know where you're going to be going, but let's sit down, let's look at some data sets, let's figure out what the questions are, and all of a sudden that one becomes five, becomes, it's just sort of, it's been a really fun and exciting and motivating piece, because you've got those long-term pieces, but then you've also got kind of those smaller milestones that you're working towards. So I've learned a lot from that experience, and I think I'll continue to take a lot away from that moving forward. So thanks for sharing.
Thanks, Marcus, and love having you on those teams. And it's been learned a lot from you, and those teams are some of my favorites for sure.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, everyone. Thanks to you, Josh, and thanks, Kira, for the facilitation, and thanks to everyone for being here. As I said on the chat window there, this is really, really refreshing for many of us. I know you could go the content way, which is also great, but you were more into strategies, which I think is very important. How do we develop strategies to make us more productive? So thank you so very much, Josh. Just to let folks know, our February event would be a pre-award grant panel. It's going to be held on February 5, a little less than 3 weeks from here, February 5, between noon and 1, and we will have a representative from the Office of Research joined in by Jason. Jason would also be part of that panel. They will walk us through the different types of pre-award support, and that is this panel is being put together based on the listening session that we had with faculty last semester. So, but I do think it's open to everyone, even graduate students can benefit from that as well. So, thank you so very much, everyone, for being here today, and look forward